Welcome to the probably the last video for this series on Rizal and desire. Last time I was talking about Rizal's supposed inferiority complex, and I was explaining that perhaps it was the writer Ante Radijk who actually had the inferiority complex, and that what was going on was he was reading himself through Rizal. That Rizal was perfectly normal in terms of the anxiety that he experienced, a kind of a kid from the province being thrown into a wider world, so to speak. And of course, it's natural that one gets anxious, that one gets sad. Although Radijk suggested that Rizal did mind his smallness, his deformed body, maybe perhaps he saw himself ugly, who knows? But the point here was Rizal was just basically in so many ways confused with the kind of world that he was being thrown into. He was actually melancholic, many times depressed. He even said that he cannot remember when he was ever happy in the first place. And I did say, for example, that he even titled the second chapter of his autobiography as something that signifies suffering. So today we look into the continuation of that Radijk examination, because Radijk suggested that it was because of his inferiority complex, Rizal's inferiority complex, that he ended up becoming sexually inadequate, and that in the entire autobiography, Rizal was actually hiding this sexual inadequacy. And that it was this sexual inadequacy, if you remember in the previous videos, it was because of this sexual inadequacy that Rizal cannot commit to anything, especially, for example, when we talk about the Philippine Revolution. So, sexual inadequacy was also important in Radijk's findings on Rizal, and today that's what we are going to talk about. So, was Jose Rizal sexually inadequate? So, I'm going to talk about the sexual division, Zeno's paradoxes, and El Fenomeno Katigbak, as Radijk calls it. So, let me start with sexual division. If you remember in the last video, this is actually just a kind of revision of what I said about the two reactions to the symbolic castration. And in the previous video, I did not name them, but now we can. And we call it the sexual division, not simply sexual difference, but division, because this is nothing to do with taking, for example, sex as a kind of gender identity and just changing identities all along. It's not that simple. It's division because once you get into, say, for example, here, masculine subjectivity or feminine subjectivity, it's almost impossible to shift from one subjectivity to the next. Now, I did not, like, what I'm doing here is I am not trying to say, for example, that all men becomes, under this masculine subjectivity and women becomes under feminine subjectivity. The point of this sexual division is that anyone can actually develop themselves within each of the category. You can be someone who has a vagina and eventually develops masculine subjectivity, or you can be someone who has a penis and eventually develops feminine subjectivity. In fact, most of the time, the baseline is feminine subjectivity. It's usually when out of castration, when someone starts to imagine something other than the reality or the social symbolic network that he is being thrown into. If one imagines something beyond that, that's usually where masculine subjectivity begins. And notice the difference here. In masculine subjectivity, everyone undergoes castration. In feminine subjectivity, no one escapes castration. Now, they sound the same, but masculine subjectivity does have the tendency to impose a kind of universal, a reminder that all of us belong in a universal set of castrated people. In feminine subjectivity, the universal is simply castration, that one cannot escape castration. In masculine subjectivity, the next thing that follows is that everyone imagines what it must be to not be castrated. This is where people start to imagine that there is something else, that there is a sort of universal ideal that somehow plays the role of an external guarantee of my subjectivity. In feminine subjectivity, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as not being castrated, because no one escapes castration. In masculine subjectivity, everyone goes under castration, but this precisely is the reason why everyone imagines that there must be a period where, or a time where, we were not yet castrated. There was no castration. And that's usually the ideal. Okay? In feminine subjectivity, there's no such thing. As I mentioned last time, feminine subjectivity accepts the social symbolic network. Masculine subjectivity rejects it by imagining something beyond. Okay? In masculine subjectivity, the barred subject looks for a state of non-castration. And this relationship of looking for a state of non-castration is simply the relationship between the barred subject and the objet petit a, the object small a. If you remember the formula for fantasy, more or less, there's a fantasy that somewhere out there is a perfect, non-castrated, ideal human being. The masculine subjectivity imagines that one. It is the ideal that completes us. The social symbolic network is a mere appearance. There has to be something more. That something more gets represented as the ideal. Through the ideal, we get to have our completion. In feminine subjectivity, it's different. The barred subject sees the object small a as complementary to its existence, not in the sense of the masculine, because the masculine looks at the object small a and fantasizes that the object small a can complete me because it belongs to the ideal. When a masculine person looks at someone and see the object small a in that someone, he begins to imagine that there is an ideal in there. part of the ideal. Something that completes me, it's in there. Okay? While on the other hand, the feminine subjectivity, they're still complementary, but the idea is that we complete each other. We are all castrated, but together we complete each other. We play around. We accept the social symbolic network, and then all of us, castrated beings, we don't need to find completion somewhere out there. We only need completion with one another. So the object small a is still visible to the other. You can still see the object small a, but you don't pretend that the object small a is part of an ideal. What you see to your neighbor, to your friends, to whoever are within your range, within your social circles, what you actually see is that we can unite together. So we complement each other in that way. We complete each other by being together. So you're seeing here that the social symbolic network is not being treated as simply appearance, but it's actually the network in which there's a field of play. We play with each other, try to work through this castrated state. That's feminine acceptance, in contrast to masculine rejection or masculine subjectivity. So again, any person can be placed into any of these two categories, and then in that way they become sexuated, and in that sexuation, that would be their sex, their gender, all throughout their life. Although I am tempted here to share with you the idea of whenever someone, for example, says, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, or I am a man trapped in a woman's body. Such a thing, if we base it in this, that is still very much masculine. There's nothing beyond or beneath for the feminine. Feminine usually just accepts everything and then has this playful will for creativity and for creation. Yeah. Especially men, in terms of masculine subjectivity, too predictable in some ways. If you have seen the this memes about a guy entering a department store, knows exactly where to go, buys what he needs to buy, and then goes out. Woman comes in, goes everywhere, explores everywhere. That's basically what it is. Exploring the social symbolic network and playing with it. Then goes out. That's an exercise in creativity. And this is also a contribution to whenever you see the meme wherein someone wrote a book about men in just a thin volume, and then someone wrote a book about women and it's a very thick volume. And that's because, especially here, feminine subjectivity does not really pretend a kind of illusory ideal. Nothing to structure reality with, in that sense of structuring. This very rigid, logocentric, rationalistic structuring of everything, which limits everything. Feminine subjectivity does not have that. Women uses reason in a quite different, creative way. Not the rigid, very strict way of men in this sense. Because I would have to presume masculine subjectivity ends up being men, feminine subjectivity ends up being woman. Okay, but one difference is men imagines ideal man. Feminine does not imagine, let's just say, ideal woman. Like there's single woman that defines all women. There's no such thing. Okay, that's the sexual division. And this is where we see the trajectory of desire. Masculine subjectivity sees desire, or does desire, very differently compares to, or in contrast to feminine subjectivity. As we said last time, masculine rejection, feminine acceptance. So, what about sex? Well, sex is real, that's for sure. But if you recall, if all of you can recall what we said about the real remains very difficult to place into symbolization. Meaning, in our creation of reality, between the imaginary and the symbolic, sex is a complicated thing. It is real in the sense that we do not place it in our reality as such. That's why people will say sex is special, sex is this, sex is that. Nobody really goes to someone and say, you know what, you look like you have a perfectly healthy sex cells, and I also have those. Can we produce something? Can we combine it and produce something? We don't really talk like that. Okay? Sex is real, that's for sure. There's no such thing as a kind of continuum in terms of sex. Biological sex is really just a question of method in terms of production. The idea that male has to be X and Y is pretty shaky, knowing that in the rest of the animal kingdom there are those who let's just say eliminated their Y chromosome and still ended up male. So we say that in nature and in culture there's no such thing as sexual rapport. And by that I say there's no such thing as sexual connection, and there's no such thing as sexual relation. What does that mean? It means that in nature there is no universal law that determines sexual relationship. There's too much diversity in the natural world that you cannot really put it into stone. That this is male, this is female, and this is sex. There's no such thing. And what we mean by there's no such thing as sexual rapport, especially in culture, has something to do with, let's go back for a bit, with sexual division. When a person, when a masculine individual looks at a feminine individual and develops desire, what that masculine is seeing is the objet petit a, the object small a. It's not the sex. It's the promise of jouissance, and the jouissance is the promise of completion. The ideal is in that person. I am in some ways gravitated towards that person because I saw or I see in that person the object cause of desire. That's the relationship. The relationship of fantasy. The barred subject trying to get the object cause of desire. In feminine subjectivity, the man that she is looking at represents the barred subject as well. And through him, not as the ideal man in a sense of the objet petit a, but as objet petit a himself. Not as a mystery, but as someone that may complete me by being together. Masculine is looking at what is beyond the existence of the person, what he imagines to be beyond that person, to be the ideal. Say, a man falls in love with his ideal. A woman falls in love with the same feather. There's no sexual relations. They are all falling in love, dictated by the castration. Right? Love. Damn, I mentioned about love. I shouldn't have, but I will explain that further later on in the year. But that's how it goes. Okay? The relationship is not sexual. Either in nature, which does not have a universal law in terms of sex, the same way as in culture, where we are all governed by symbolic castration. And of course, the power of the object small a. The object cause of desire. So desire is not pointed to that person per se. It's pointed towards the object cause of desire. That's where you are having a relationship with. As again, love enters here in a very violent way, but we'll deal with that much, much later on. So what about sexual inadequacy? Is there ever such a thing as sexual inadequacy, since there is no such thing as sexual relations? How do we define sexual inadequacy? Because sexual inadequacy in Radhaik's sense appears to be the objet petit a. Rizal has to reach this ideal state in order to be a man. Is there ever such a thing? That's why I'm comparing it here with Zeno's paradoxes. And if you look at this picture here, remember when I said about desire moving asymptotically, that a person cannot really grab hold of the objet petit a, cannot really grab hold of the object cause of desire. You can only approach the object cause of desire, but can never reach it. And this is precisely why I said there's always a promise of jouissance. It's a promise all the time. How? Well, let me introduce to you Zeno's paradoxes if you're not familiar. One of the recurring paradox that Zeno was famous of was the paradox of infinite distance. Say, imagine traveling from point A to point B. In order to do that, you have to travel half of point A and point B. So let's just say point A prime. So in order to reach point B, you have to go through A prime. But in order to go A prime, you have to travel half of the distance between A and A prime. So let's just say A double prime. You get the idea here of infinite distance. A double prime, A triple prime, quadruple prime, etc., so on and so on. There's always a half. Right? 1/2, 1/4 goes on. Like an asymptote. It attempts to reach a point, can never really reach a point. The other paradox would be this one here, the picture here. You have Achilles and the tortoise. So according to the story, let's place the tortoise ahead and place Achilles at the back because Achilles is fast and the tortoise is rather slow. But here's the thing. By the time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise was placed, the tortoise was already beyond that point. Okay? So here, Achilles reaches the point, but the tortoise already also moved, albeit, very minimal distance. But still, the tortoise is ahead. So every time Achilles, for example, here catches up with the position of the tortoise is already in a different position as well. Same goes so on and so on. That is man's relation with sexual adequacy. It escapes us all the time. Well, as we said, there's no such thing as sexual relations, and sex is real. We can never really place it within our hands enough to say, all right, now I'm sexually adequate and therefore I can do this and do that. Or if I'm the observer, I can say, look, buddy, you are now sexually inadequate, therefore you can do this and you can do that. There's no point of measurement. The path to adequacy is the path of desire, asymptotic. There's no such thing as sexual adequacy behind the curtain of inadequacy. So if we are looking at this one in terms of the masculine rejection of the socio-symbolic network, when we're looking at there's a curtain of inadequacy, behind it there's sexual inadequacy. This is the essence of being a man. In order to become sexually adequate, you have to move through the curtain. When you look behind the curtain, you will realize that you're bringing with you what you are looking for. Sexual adequacy is always on us to determine. Sometimes you don't even determine it. The moment you see, I'm sexually adequate, nothing changed, really. It's just a change of, let's just say the only thing that changed is the change of perspective. Not that somehow there's a hidden essence of being adequate in terms of sex. So the path towards sexual inadequacy is an impossible path. It's the path of Zeno's paradox. It's an infinite distance. Okay? So we go lastly to El Fenomeno, Katigbak. If you have read the Memorias, then probably you already know this one. And if you have read the Anatomy of the Antihero, then you've already, imagined this one, how this one works out. Rizal's obsession with his body led to his inferiority complex. Inferiority complex made Rizal sexually inadequate. Rizal hid this sexual inadequacy in terms of morality. Sexual inadequacy is the inability to commit to anything. The story here is that Rizal and Segunda love each other, but out of some ethical or moral question, Rizal left. Now, there's a little play here in which maybe perhaps the objet petit-a was no longer with Segunda Katigbak. We'll talk about it when we talk about love, but my point is, it has nothing to do with inferiority complex or sexual inadequacy. This is the relationship that they are having in a game of seduction, for example. They were playing it, getting on with it. Then eventually Rizal simply give it up. But Radai mistook human subjectivity as a mental illness. The object cause of desire, the promise of jouissance, was no longer with Segunda Katigbak. There's nothing to do with Rizal being sexually inadequate. Sexual inadequacy can only play within the structure of sexual adequacy. You have to figure out what do we mean by sexual adequacy first, which does not exist because there's no such thing as sexual rapport. There's no universal law that determines what it means to be sexually connected with another. Either in nature or in culture, we just make things up. Rizal simply give the making things up. He was not sexually inadequate. He's just a common guy, anxious of the things that he did or he was about to do, and eventually he left Segunda Katigbak. People do that. It's not like this is something weird. Many people do this. I'll explain that later on this year. But that's basically it for this video. Thank you, and see you for the more serious videos on history to come. This would be the last, at least for now, in terms of desire. See you next time.